The chandelier above the Marchwell ballroom held 2,000 candles, and Ottilie Brennan had counted every one of them while waiting in the servants' alcove behind the velvet curtain. She counted things when her hands could not work. It was her 3rd hour standing in that alcove. The pincushion strapped to her wrist had grown warm against her pulse. She had been called in at the last moment because the bride-to-be had torn the hem of her gown stepping out of the carriage, and no one but Ottilie had been quick enough with a needle to mend it before the announcement. She had stitched the tier shut in the cold passageway behind the kitchens, kneeling on stone while the future Duchess of Ravenmore stood above her in 12,000 pounds of French silk and refused to look down. Ottilie had bitten the thread with her teeth, the way her mother had taught her, and pretended she could not feel the woman trembling. Now she waited. Her instructions had been clear. Do not leave until the announcement was concluded, in case the gown failed again. Stand behind the curtain. Do not be seen. Through the gap in the velvet, she watched the ballroom bloom with light and laughter. Lords and ladies pooled like spilled wine across the marble floor, and the orchestra played something slow and silvery, and the air smelled of beeswax and orange blossom. She should not have looked, but she looked because she was 19 years old and tired, and tonight, just for a moment, she wanted to see. The Duke of Ravenmore stood at the head of the ballroom on a low dais of polished oak. He was tall, taller than the men around him, and dressed in black so deep it drank the candlelight. His hair was the color of wet ash, swept back from a face that did not smile easily. They said he was cold. They said his estate had been crushed beneath debt when his elder brother died, and that he had spent 5 years rebuilding it with the patience of a stonemason. They said he never laughed, and that he loved no one, and that he would marry whichever woman his mother chose for him, because grief had hollowed out the part of him that used to choose for himself. Ottilie had never seen him before tonight. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been carved out of his own life, rather than born into it. Beside him stood Lady Persen Halvorth. She was beautiful. Ottilie acknowledged this the way one acknowledges weather. Lady Persen's hair was the gold of polished brass. Her gown, Ottilie's gown, the one she had stitched and refitted 3 times in 2 weeks, fitted her like water. The pearls around her throat were the size of robin eggs. She held the Duke's arm with the easy possession of a woman who had been promised something for a long time and was finally collecting. A bell rang. The orchestra fell silent. The ballroom turned toward the dais, like a field of flowers turning toward the sun. The Duke's mother, Ottilie, recognized the dowager from miniature portraits she had stitched into a christening blanket 2 summers ago, stepped forward. The old woman wore plum silk and a heavy collar of garnets, and she spoke without notes. "My friends," she said, and her voice carried like a bell struck in a stone chapel. "Tonight, I have the great pleasure of announcing the engagement of my son, Cassius Halloran Vane, 8th Duke of Ravenmore, to Lady Persen Halvorth, daughter of the Earl of Tremaine." The applause came in a wave so loud that Ottilie felt it in her sternum. Lady Persen smiled. She lifted her chin and let the room admire her, and the diamonds in her ears caught the candlelight and threw it back in tiny, sharp flashes. The Duke did not smile. He inclined his head once, gravely, the way a soldier accepts a medal he did not ask for. The dowager turned and gestured toward the orchestra, and the music began again, a slow processional, the kind played at the start of long evenings. Ottilie should have stepped back behind the curtain. She did not. She watched as the Duke lifted his eyes from the dais and let his gaze travel across the ballroom. Slow, deliberate, the gaze of a man performing the duty of being looked at. His eyes moved over the heads of barons and dowagers, over feathers and fans and laughing mouths. They moved, and then they stopped. They stopped on her. Ottilie's breath caught somewhere beneath her ribs and refused to come out. He could not be looking at her. The curtain was drawn. She was a sliver of gray wool and white apron in a shadowed gap, half a face at most. She was no one. She was the seamstress, the hands, the pin in the wrist, the bitten thread. But he was looking at her, directly at her. His eyes had stopped moving the way a pendulum stops when something heavy catches it, and his face, his careful, carved, hollowed-out face, changed. It was a small change. A stranger would not have caught it. But Ottilie had spent her life watching faces above her while she pinned hems, and she had learned to read the smallest shifts. The Duke of Ravenmore was looking at her as though he had seen her before, as though he were trying to remember where. Ottilie's hand rose to the curtain without her permission and gripped it. Her thimble, the one her mother had given her, brass scratched soft with use, slipped from her apron pocket and struck the marble floor with a sound thinner than a coin. In a ballroom full of 2,000 candles and an orchestra and 400 guests, the sound should not have traveled. It traveled. The Duke's eyes flicked downward, just for an instant, toward the floor at the base of the curtain, then back up, to her. And this time, his expression was not confusion. It was recognition. Lady Persen touched his arm. She said something at his ear. Something light. Something laughing. He turned to answer her with the smooth grace of long practice, and the moment broke, and Ottilie stepped backward into the dark of the alcove, with her heart beating so hard against her stays that she thought the boning would crack. She had imagined it. She had stood for 3 hours in a drafty alcove and seen what she wanted to see. Dukes did not recognize seamstresses. Dukes did not even see seamstresses. But the thimble was still on the marble floor on the wrong side of the curtain. And somewhere on the far side of the velvet, Ottilie heard the soft, deliberate sound of a man's footsteps leaving the dais. She did not move. She could not move. Her spine had pressed itself flat against the alcove wall, and her lungs had forgotten the rhythm of breathing. And somewhere on the marble floor lay a small brass thimble that had her mother's initials scratched inside the rim. The footsteps did not come quickly. That was almost worse. A man walking slowly, deliberately, away from his own engagement announcement and toward a servant's alcove. That was a man making a decision. Ottilie heard him stop on the other side of the curtain. She heard the rustle of fine wool as he bent down. She heard the small, precise click of the thimble being lifted from the marble. There was a long pause. He did not pull the curtain back. He did not speak. He simply stood there, holding her thimble in his hand, and Ottilie understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he was reading the engraving inside. M.B. 3 small marks scratched into brass with the point of a sewing pin, decades ago, by a girl named Merwin Brennan, who had not yet been Ottilie's mother. The Duke of Ravenmore was reading her dead mother's initials. Ottilie pressed her hand against her mouth. "Come out, please." His voice was low and quiet, calibrated to carry no further than the curtain. There was no command in it. It was the voice of a man asking a favor he had no right to ask. She did not come out. "I will not embarrass you," he said after a moment. "I only wish to return this. Please." She thought wildly of running. There was a service door at the end of the alcove. She could be home in 20 minutes. She could pretend none of this had happened. But her thimble was in his hand, the only thing she had left of the woman who had taught her every stitch she knew. Ottilie stepped out from behind the curtain. The Duke was closer than she had thought. He stood perhaps 3 feet from the velvet, his back half turned to the ballroom, screening her from the room with the breadth of his own shoulders. Up close, he was even taller, and the candlelight caught the silver at his temples that the distance had hidden. His eyes were gray, not blue as she had assumed, the color of slate after rain. He was holding the thimble between his thumb and forefinger, as though it were made of glass. "This is yours," he said. "Yes, your grace." "And the initials?" "My mother's, your grace." His eyes did not leave her face. "Merwin?" The world went still. Ottilie heard the orchestra. She heard laughter from the far end of the ballroom. She heard her own pulse in her ears, which had climbed into her throat and now beat there like a trapped bird. "How?" she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "How do you know that name?" He did not answer at first. His jaw worked, the way a man's jaw works when he is choosing between several truths and trying to find the smallest one. "I knew a Merwin Brennan," he said finally. "A long time ago. She mended my brother's coat when we were children. He fell from a horse and tore the sleeve to the elbow, and a young woman in a market square took it from him and stitched it back together for nothing because she said he had a kind face. He was 12. I was 10. I remember her thimble. She let me hold it. She said her own mother had given it to her." Ottilie's eyes filled before she could stop them. "Tell me your name," he said. "Ottilie. Ottilie Brennan, your grace." "Her daughter?" "Yes." He closed his hand around the thimble. He did not give it back. "My God," he said softly. "I have spent 22 years thinking about a stranger's kindness to my brother, and tonight, of all nights," he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Behind them, the ballroom shifted. A new voice was rising over the orchestra, querulous, sharp, and carrying. "Cassius! Cassius! Where on earth has he gone?" The dowager. The Duke's face hardened, not against Ottilie, but against the room. He looked over his shoulder, then back at her, and spoke very quickly. "Where do you live?" "Threadneedle Lane, your grace. Number 11. Above the chandler's shop, but my steward will call on you tomorrow morning at 9. He will bring you here, to my study. I have something I must say to you, and I cannot say it now. Will you come?" "Your grace, Will you come, Miss Brennan?" There was no command in his voice. There was, instead, something Ottilie did not have a name for. A man asking. A man who had spent 22 years not asking anything of anyone, asking now. "I will come," she said. He pressed the thimble back into her palm. His fingers brushed hers, gloved, but warm through the kid leather, and the sensation went up her arm like a struck note. "Thank you," he said. Then he was gone, walking back across the ballroom with the same long, unhurried stride he had used to leave it, and Ottilie was left standing in the alcove with a thimble in her hand and a tremor in her knees, and the absolute certainty that her life had just stopped being the life she had woken up inside. She did not see the woman watching her from the gilded mirror at the far end of the ballroom. She did not see Lady Persen Halvorth smile, fixed and bright, slowly turning to porcelain as her future husband returned to her side and offered no explanation for where he had been. But Lady Persen had seen, and Lady Persen, the daughter of the Earl of Tremaine, did not forget what she saw. Ottilie did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed at number 11 Threadneedle Lane with the thimble in her hand, and the candle burned down to a stub, and she watched the gray light come in through the casement window the way a condemned woman watches the dawn. At 8:30, a black carriage pulled into Threadneedle Lane. The horses were matched grays, and the steward who knocked on her door wore livery the color of an inkstein. He was a thin, grave man, with eyes like a careful accountant, and he bowed to Ottilie as though she were not a seamstress in a stuff gown, but a woman whose name belonged on a calling card. "Miss Brennan, His Grace asked me to bring you to Ravenmore House. Are you ready?" She was wearing her best dress. It was 3 years old and the color of stone. "Yes," she said. The carriage moved through London at the slow, polite pace of a vehicle that did not need to hurry, and by the time it turned through a pair of iron gates and rolled up a gravel drive, The houses on either side had become palaces, and ahead of her, set against a gray October sky, stood Ravenmore House. It was vast. It was honey-colored stone and tall windows, and a portico large enough to drive a coach beneath, and Ottilie understood at once why her hands had begun to shake. The steward led her up a staircase, wide enough for 6 women to climb abreast, and stopped before a heavy door at the end of a long corridor. He knocked twice. "Enter." The Duke's study was lined floor to ceiling with books. A fire burned low in a marble hearth. A long desk of dark walnut stood beneath a window that looked out across a walled garden. The Duke was not behind the desk. He was standing at the window, his back to the door, dressed in a dark green coat that Ottilie recognized before she remembered where from. She had stitched it. 3 years ago. Madame Vautrin's workroom on Old Bond Street. A commission from a duke's tailor for a coat to be worn in the country. Ottilie had finished the buttonholes herself because the senior seamstress had a fever. She had stitched 18 buttonholes by candlelight in a single evening, each one a perfect parallel to the last, and she had whispered a small, foolish wish into the 18th one because her mother had told her, when she was small, that a stitch made with a wish in it would carry the wish wherever the cloth went. She remembered the wish. Let him be happy, whoever he is. The Duke turned. "Miss Brennan." "Your Grace." He looked tired. He looked like a man who had also not slept. He gestured for her to sit, and she sat. "I owe you an explanation. Several explanations. I would like, if you will allow it, to give them to you in order." "Your Grace, Please, let me speak first." She closed her mouth and folded her hands in her lap. "My brother died 11 years ago," he said. "His name was Lysander. He was the 7th Duke of Ravenmore. He was 23. His horse went down on a wet stone, and he struck his head, and he did not wake. He was the best man I have ever known. From the moment of his death until last night, I have been doing the work of being him, and I have not been particularly successful at being myself." He paused. The fire popped softly in the hearth. "My mother wishes me to marry. She has wished it for 5 years. She put before me a series of suitable young women, and I refused them all, until this autumn, when she put before me Lady Percen Halvorth, and I did not refuse her, because I had grown tired of refusing, and because I had decided that being married again to someone I felt nothing for would be no worse than the silence I have lived in. The announcement was made last night." "Yes," Ottilie whispered. "I had resolved to go through with it. And then I dropped my eyes across a ballroom and saw a face behind a curtain, and I thought I had seen a ghost. The young woman who mended my brother's coat in a market square in Shrewsbury when I was 9 years old." He looked at her then, fully, for the first time. "You have her face, Miss Brennan." Ottilie's eyes filled again. She had not cried last night, in the alcove, or the carriage, or her own bed. She cried now, silently. 2 slow tears, because no one had told her in 9 years that she had her mother's face. "She died," she said, "when I was 10, of a fever. My father went the year after. I have lived alone since I was 16. I'm sorry. You said you owed me explanations. You owe me none, Your Grace. Your brother's coat was mended because my mother was kind. Kindness does not make a debt." "No," he said, "but it makes a memory. And memories, Miss Brennan, can sit in a man for 22 years and wait." He moved at last, away from the window. He sat in the chair opposite hers, which surprised her, a duke choosing to be at her eye level. And he leaned his forearms on his knees, the way a tired farmer might at the end of a day. "I'm going to ask you something now that you may refuse, and if you refuse, my carriage will take you home, and I will never trouble you again." "I am listening, Your Grace. My household requires a seamstress." It was so much smaller than she had expected him to say that for a moment she did not understand it at all. My mother's lady's maid is not skilled with fine needlework. My sister has come of age, and her wardrobe must be rebuilt. My fiancé, he hesitated, will require a great deal of new clothing. I have a wish, Miss Brennan, to engage a private seamstress. Someone who would live in this house, who would be paid a wage 3 times what your workshop earns in a year, who would have a workroom of her own and an apprentice if she required one, and who would be free, at the end of 1 year, to leave with references that would open any door in London. He stopped. He waited. Why me? She said. Because when I think of placing my family's clothing in a stranger's hands, I find I cannot. And because when I saw your face last night, I thought, there is a debt in me older than my dukedom, and I have been given a chance to pay it. Your Grace, that is charity, not employment. It is employment. I will work you hard. My fiancé will be difficult. You will earn every penny. Does she know you mean to install the woman she saw you cross a ballroom for in her future household? No. I will tell her this afternoon. I am asking you, Miss Brennan, to enter a house where you will not be welcomed by one of its mistresses. Then why? Because last night I saw your face, and I have not slept since, and I have realized that I have spent 11 years arranging my life so carefully that I no longer know the difference between what I want and what I have agreed to. You are the first thing in 11 years I have not wanted to arrange. I owe you the truth. The fire popped again. The room was very still. Ottilie thought of her workshop on Threadneedle Lane, the cold up the stairs in winter, the way her hands had begun to ache last winter, in a way her mother's had ached, at the end. She thought of her mother saying, "A stitch made with a wish in it carries the wish wherever the cloth goes." He was wearing the coat. He had been wearing it all this time. The knowledge sat in her chest like a struck bell. I have 3 conditions, she heard herself say. His gray eyes lifted. Something moved behind them. Name them. First, I am a seamstress, Your Grace, not a companion, not a confidant, not a guest. I will be paid for my work, and I will eat with the upper servants, and I will be addressed as Miss Brennan by everyone in this household, including you, in the presence of others. Agreed. Second, my workshop on Threadneedle Lane will not be closed. It will be left in the care of my apprentice, Mary Pell, and at the end of the year, whatever happens here, I will go back to it. Agreed. Third, she drew a breath. If you ever, at any point, find that you have changed your mind about your engagement, you will tell Lady Persson before you tell me. I came from nothing, Your Grace, but I will not become the cause of another woman's humiliation. He looked at her for a long moment. I promise you, he said, before her, always before her, or never at all. He rose. He held out his hand, the way men hold out their hands to seal a thing, and after a small, steadying breath, Ottilie rose and put her hand in his. His grip was warm and firm and absolutely steady, and as her fingers closed around his palm, her eyes fell, by accident, by fate, on the cuff of his green wool sleeve, and she saw, perfectly stitched, 18 buttonholes she would have known in the dark. He did not see her see them. He did not yet know that he had been carrying her hands on his body for 3 years. The carriage that returned Ottilie to Threadneedle Lane that afternoon was smaller, plainer, a vehicle a steward used for unobtrusive errands. The Duke had thought of this. He did not wish her neighbors to see a glossy black carriage outside her door twice in one day. She packed in the dark. It was not difficult. She had not accumulated much in 19 years. 2 gowns, a wool shawl her mother had knitted, her father's pocket watch, which had not run since 1812, her sewing kit, her mother's thimble, a small wooden box of letters she did not open. Mary Pell came at 6, summoned by the boy from the chandler's shop. Mary was 16 and had hands like a small bird's, and when Ottilie told her what had happened, she sat down heavily on the workshop stool and stared. A duke? Yes. You're going to live in a duke's house. I am going to work in a duke's house, Mary. Is there a difference? Ottilie did not answer. She gave Mary the keys and the rent ledger and told her which orders to honor. She promised wages on the 1st of every month, and she made Mary promise in return to write her a letter every Sunday, whether anything had happened or not. And if something does happen? Then write twice. The carriage came at 7. Mary stood on the doorstep of the chandler's shop with one hand pressed against her mouth and watched Ottilie climb in. Ottilie did not look back. She was afraid that if she looked back, she would not be able to climb in at all. Ravenmore House was on Carrowmere Square, a name she had not known last night and would not forget for the rest of her life. By the time she arrived, the lamps had been lit in the front hall, and the great door opened before she had finished climbing the steps. A woman stood waiting in the marble entrance. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, dressed in black bombazine with a heavy ring of keys at her belt. Her hair was iron gray and pulled into a knot so severe it must have ached. Her eyes were the careful, measuring eyes of a woman who had run a great house for 30 years and had never once been surprised by a person. Miss Brennan. I am Mrs. Halverston, the housekeeper. His Grace asked me to greet you personally. You will find that I am the only person in this house, besides His Grace, who has been informed of the particular nature of your engagement here. To everyone else, you are the seamstress the Dowager has long wished for. Do we understand each other? Yes, Mrs. Halverston. Good. Her face did not soften, but something in her shoulders did. Follow me, please. Ravenmore House was a country inside a city. They climbed 2 staircases and walked 3 corridors, and Ottilie counted doors the way she had counted candles, because counting was what she did when she could not feel her feet. They came at last to a wing she understood was set apart, older, quieter. This wing is yours, Mrs. Halverston said. The first door is your bedchamber. The second is your sitting room. The third is your workroom. They were the rooms of the late Duke's grandmother, who was a great needlewoman herself. They have been closed for 40 years. She opened the first door. The bedchamber was not grand. That was the first kindness. It was a small paneled room with a low ceiling and a fire already lit, and a narrow bed made up with linen that smelled of lavender. It was a room for a woman who worked, not for a woman on display. The third door was the workroom, and at this, Ottilie had to put her hand on the doorframe. The room was long and high and floored in pale wood. 3 tall windows let in the last gray light of afternoon, and a great oak table stood under them, scarred and worn smooth by 40 years of long dead hands. Along one wall was a press for fabric, and along another a wall of small drawers, hundreds of them, each labeled in fading copper plate. Above the press hung a row of shears in graded sizes. A dressmaker's form stood by the window, padded in soft canvas, waiting. It was a queen's workroom. It was a workroom her mother would have wept to stand inside. It will need restocking, Mrs. Halverston said. His Grace asked me to tell you that you may order whatever materials you require. The accounts will be opened in your name at any merchant of your choosing, beginning tomorrow. Mrs. Halverston, this is too much. It is what was prepared for you, miss. His Grace asks little of his household. When he asks, we provide. At the door she paused. A word, Miss Brennan. There are members of this household who will be glad of a new face. There are others who will not. I count myself among the first. I would advise you, gently, miss, to do your work with your head down for the first month, and let the house come to its own judgments. I will. Good. Welcome to Ravenmoor." She closed the door behind her. Ottilie stood alone in the workroom of a dead Duchess and listened to the house settle around her, the small, distant sounds of servants going about their evening, the wind moving in the chimneys. She walked to the great oak table and laid her palm flat on it. The wood was cold. It would warm. She was unpacking her sewing kit when the knock came. It was soft, almost apologetic. 2 quick raps and then a pause, as though the knocker were already half regretting the sound. She crossed to the door and opened it. There was no one there. She looked down. A square of folded paper lay on the floor at the threshold, cream-colored, heavy stock, sealed with a smear of dark red wax that had been pressed flat with a thumb instead of a signet ring. Ottilie stooped slowly and picked it up. She stepped back inside her room. She closed the door. She slid the small iron bolt across, which she had not intended to do. She broke the wax. The paper unfolded into a single line of writing, in a tight slanted hand she did not know. "Leave this house by morning. Go back to your needles in your alley. You do not know what he is. You do not know what she will do. If you stay, your apprentice on Threadneedle Lane will not have a workshop to go to by the end of the week. Consider this a kindness. There will not be a second." There was no signature. Ottilie sat down on the edge of the bed because her knees would not hold her, and she read the line again, and a third time, and the candle on the writing table guttered in a draft she could not feel. Somewhere in this house, somewhere very near, because the wax was still slightly soft beneath her thumb, someone had stood at her door and bent down and slid this paper under the gap and walked away on quiet feet, and that someone knew her apprentice's name and where she lived and how to ruin her. Ottilie folded the paper twice. She slipped it into the small carved box where she kept her mother's letters. She blew out the candle. She did not undress. She lay down on the lavender-smelling bed, and she waited for morning, and she did not close her eyes once. Morning came slowly in October. Ottilie was already at the workroom table when Sally, the housemaid assigned to her wing, brought up a tray of bread and tea at 7:30. The girl was cheerful and red-cheeked and very young, perhaps 14, and she chattered about the weather and the kitchen cat, and Ottilie listened to her gratefully because Sally's voice filled the room in a way that pushed the night a little further back. She had decided at some point between 3 and 4 o'clock that she would not run. Whoever had slid the note beneath her door had counted on a frightened seamstress disappearing back into her alley. She would not be that woman, but she would not be a fool either. She would write to her old friend Peter Halverston, who was a constable in the Bow Street office, and who happened, by an accident of names and parishes, to be Mrs. Halverston's nephew. She would ask Peter to walk past the workshop at odd hours for the next fortnight. She would say nothing of the note to anyone in this house. Not yet, because she did not know who in this house had written it. She had finished her bread, and was halfway through her second cup of tea when Mrs. Halverston knocked. "The Dowager Duchess will see you at 9, miss, in her sitting room," the blue door at the end of the long gallery. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenmoor was seated by the window of her sitting room, a small loom of colored wools across her knees. She was working a pattern of climbing roses, and her hands moved with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had been doing this since before Ottilie had been born. "Sit," the Dowager said, without looking up. Ottilie sat. "You are 19. You are an orphan. You make your living with a needle. And my son brought you into this house yesterday because 22 years ago, on a market day in Shrewsbury, your mother stitched up his brother's coat sleeve and refused payment." Ottilie inhaled sharply. The Dowager looked up at last. Her eyes were the same slate gray as her son's, but where his were tired, hers were sharp as new pins. "Do not be surprised, child. He came to me last night and told me everything. He told me about the alcove and the thimble and the buttonholes. He told me you would be the household seamstress. He told me he had explained to Lady Persen last evening the nature of his arrangement with you, and that Lady Persen had received the news with considerable grace. I am glad of that, Your Grace. Are you? Then you are a fool. The dowager set down her wools. Lady Persen does not receive any news with grace. She performs grace, which is a different thing, and the performance always costs someone. It is going to cost you, Miss Brennan. I am going to ask you a question, the dowager said. I will know if you lie. Did my son speak to you in his study yesterday of his feelings? He spoke to me of his brother, Your Grace, and of his engagement. He did not speak of feelings. Did he speak of his wife? The word stopped her. Your Grace. He is not yet his wife, Cordelia, who died 9 years ago, in the 3rd year of his dukedom, of a fall from a horse on the same stretch of road on which his brother had died 2 years before her. Did he speak of her? Ottilie's mouth had gone dry. No, Your Grace, he did not. The dowager nodded once and turned her face back to the window. Of course he did not. He never does. He has not spoken her name aloud in this house in 7 years. He is a man who lost a brother, and then a wife in the space of 2 years, Miss Brennan, and he has been carrying the weight of those losses on his back ever since. She lifted her loom again. He came alive last night, for the first time in 9 years. I sat at the foot of the dais and watched him, and his face changed. And when he came back to the dais, he was a man who had been touched by something. I have not seen him touched by anything since the day they brought Cordelia home. She lifted her eyes again. You did that. I do not know how. But you did it, Miss Brennan, and you should know what you did, because I'm about to tell you what it is going to cost. Your Grace, Be quiet, child. I am not finished. Ottilie was quiet. Lady Persen is not a stupid woman. She saw what I saw. She will marry my son in the spring because his name and his estate are worth more to her family than her own pride. And she will be polite to you in this house, because politeness is a weapon she wields better than any other woman of her generation. And she will, by Christmas, have done something to make you leave. I have not yet decided whether I will permit it. Your Grace, I have not decided, the dowager repeated, because in 9 years, child, I have watched my son turn into a kind of stone, and I have prayed every Sunday and most Tuesdays for something or someone to crack him open. And last night, in front of 400 guests and an orchestra and his own future wife, something cracked. I am old enough to know that prayers are sometimes answered through doors we did not think to open. She lifted her loom and worked one more careful row. There is a woman in this house, she said, whose buried gown your mother stitched. Ottilie's chest went still. Cordelia's wedding gown. When she died, she was buried in it, because Cassius could not bear to choose another. The gown was made by Madame Vautrin, but the fine work, the lace at the neck and the 84 pearls along the bodice, was sublet to a Mrs. Brennan of Whitechapel, who was the only seamstress in London who could attach pearls without a single visible knot. I remember the name because I signed the bill myself. The dowager's eyes were unblinking. Your mother stitched the gown my son's wife was buried in. She did not know. He does not know. I have known for 9 years, and I have told no one. I am telling you now, Miss Brennan, because you are a young woman walking into a house full of ghosts, and you deserve to know which ones have your name on them. Ottilie could not speak. The dowager set down her loom. She rose, she crossed the room, and took Ottilie's hand briefly, and held it for the space of one breath. "You may go. Begin your work today. Begin with my granddaughter. She is impatient and will be cross if she is not measured first." "Your Grace, why are you telling me this?" The Dowager looked at her for a long moment. "Because someone in this house slid a note under your door last night. Mrs. Halverston saw the wax on the floor and reported it to me at 6 this morning. I do not yet know who. I am telling you what I am telling you, so that when the second note comes, and it will come, you will know that you are not alone in this house. Now go." Ottilie went. She did not remember the long gallery. She did not remember the staircase. She found herself in her own workroom with her hand on the great oak table, and she stood there for a long time, and she did not cry, because she had used all her crying yesterday, and there was none left. Her mother had stitched the dead Duchess's burial gown. Her hands had carried his dead wife into the ground. And he didn't know. For the next 11 days, Ottilie did her work with her head down. She measured Lady Sabriel, the Duke's sister, 18 years old, dark-haired and laughing, who burst into the workroom on the second morning and announced, "I am Sabriel, and I am to be your friend. There is no point in resisting." Ottilie, who had not laughed in 5 days, had laughed. She measured Lady Percen, who arrived on the 4th morning and stood on the small platform in the center of the workroom for 45 minutes without once meeting Ottilia's eyes. The next morning, Lady Percen sent her own lady's maid back with a list of 17 alterations and a note on rose-pink paper, which read, "Miss Brennan, please ensure that the final fitting takes place at my mother's house in Belgravia rather than at Ravenmore. The light is better at Tremaine. P.H." The note was perfectly polite. Ottilie understood it perfectly. She had not seen the Duke since the morning in his study. She kept her hands busy. She ordered new silks from a merchant on Bedford Street, and stitched 8 pairs of gloves for Lady Sabriel, and let the long, thin loneliness of the workroom settle around her like a known weather. On the 12th day, in the late afternoon, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. They were not Mrs. Halverston's. They were not Sally's. They were not a woman's at all. The footsteps stopped at her workroom door. A long pause, then a knock. 2 raps. Quiet. "Come in," Ottilie said. The Duke of Ravenmore stood in the doorway. He was dressed plainly, and he held something flat under his arm. A wooden box, perhaps a foot long, very old, the corners rubbed pale by handling. "Miss Brennan." "Your Grace." "May I come in?" "It is your workroom, Your Grace." "It is yours, Miss Brennan, while you are in this house. I was raised by my mother, not to enter rooms that belong to other people without permission." She set down her seam. "Please." He came in. He closed the door behind him, slowly, deliberately, leaving an inch of light at the threshold, the way a man closes a door who knows that closing it entirely would be improper. He set the box on the great oak table. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "Not the Dowager. My father's wife. She died when I was 3. I do not remember her. The box has stood on a shelf in the linen room for 57 years, and I asked my mother last week whether she might object to my giving it to you, and she did not object." He stepped back. "Open it." Ottilie opened the box. It was a sewing kit, but it was the kind of sewing kit that was not about sewing. It was the kind that had been made for a woman who would never lack thread, who would never lack work, who would never need to stitch a torn coat in a market square for a stranger. The interior was lined in faded blue silk. There were 6 pairs of shears in graduated sizes, each handle inlaid with mother of pearl. There were spools of silk thread in 22 colors. There was a needle case carved from ivory, a pincushion stuffed with wool from sheep on the Ravenmore estate, and a small silver thimble, slim and engraved with a coronet. And in the very center of the kit, set into a small velvet recess, as though it had been the most precious thing of all, was a tiny pair of embroidery scissors shaped like a heron. Ottilie put her hand against her mouth. "Your Grace, I cannot take this." "I am not asking you to take it, Miss Brennan. I am asking you to use it. It has not been used in 57 years. Tools that are not used become objects, and objects in this house already outnumber the living. I would rather it became a tool again." "This belonged to your mother." "Yes, and she would, I think, have liked it to be in the hands of a woman who would understand what it was. There's not been such a woman in this house until now." She lifted her eyes from the box at last. He was standing on the other side of the great oak table, with his hands clasped lightly behind his back, the way a man stood when he was offering something that mattered to him, and did not wish the offering to be felt his weight. "Why now, Your Grace?" "Because I have not slept well for 11 days. Because I came to this room every evening on my way to my own, and stopped at the corridor and turned back. A man who lurks at corridors is not making a choice. He is hesitating. Today, I decided I would not hesitate further." She did not know what to say. He looked down at the box. His gray eyes traced the small heron-shaped scissors. "There is one more thing, Miss Brennan, that I should say." "May I?" "Yes." He lifted his eyes and held hers. "I have been wearing your hands for 3 years." The blood left Ottilie's face. "Your Grace." "A green wool coat, made by Madame Vautrin's establishment. Finished in the autumn of the year we lost my brother's old hunting hound. I noticed this morning, while my valet was brushing it, that the buttonholes are made in a particular way, slightly fuller at the inner edge than at the outer. It is not a fashionable stitch. My valet said he had thought for 3 years that it was the work of a left-handed seamstress because the angle is reversed." He paused. "You stitched left-handed when you were 16 and finishing buttonholes by candlelight for a tailor's order. Did you not, Miss Brennan?" "I am right-handed, but when I am tired, my right hand cramps, so I learned to finish with my left. And on the 18th buttonhole of that coat, is there anything I should know?" She could not lie to him. "There is a wish in it, Your Grace." "What was the wish?" "That you should be happy, whoever you were." The room went still in a way that rooms only go still when something irreversible has happened in them. Ottilie watched his gray eyes fill and not spill, the way a man's eyes fill when he has spent 11 years training them not to. He did not move toward her. He did not need to. The distance between them had been crossed in the saying. "You stitched a wish for my happiness," he said, "into a coat I have worn nearly every day for 3 years. The years I had decided to live without one. Your Grace, I did not know. No, you could not have. I am not accusing you, Miss Brennan. I am." He stopped. He pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his closed eyes. When he lowered it, his face had gathered itself again, but only just. "I have not been happy in 11 years. I had decided I had used up whatever portion of happiness was due to a man like me. And it appears, Miss Brennan, that for 3 of those years I have been walking around in a coat with your wish stitched inside it, and that the wish—" He did not finish. "I should leave you to your work," he said. "Your Grace, no, please. I came to bring you the kit. I have brought it. Until then, Miss Brennan." He turned to go. At the door, he paused, his hand on the handle, and he said, without looking back, "The wish has been working, you know, for 3 years. I did not feel it, but it has." Then he was gone. Ottilie sat down on the stool beside the great oak table because her legs had stopped agreeing to hold her, and somewhere on the other side of the door, She heard the Duke's footsteps walk slowly down the corridor and pause once, halfway along, and continue. He had stopped, halfway down the corridor, the way a man stops when he is deciding whether to turn back. He hadn't turned back, but he had stopped. And Ottilie Brennan understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had crossed a threshold she had not seen until she was already on the other side. The wish had been working. She had not known she was still wishing. The invitation came on Thursday evening, hand-delivered by a footman in Tremaine livery, sealed in pink wax. Lady Persen Halverth requests the honor of Miss Ottilie Brennan's presence at a small gathering at Tremaine House on the evening of the 28th instant. The seamstress is to bring her measuring tape. There will be ladies present who require the services of a private needlewoman, and Lady Persen wishes Miss Brennan to be introduced to them. Ottilie read the invitation twice and understood it on the second reading. It was a summons to be displayed. Lady Persen had not been able to remove her from Ravenmore House. The Dowager had made that clear in the quiet, irrevocable way the Dowager made things clear. So Lady Persen had decided on a different campaign. She would render the seamstress visible. She would take the secret arrangement out of the workroom and parade it through the drawing rooms of Belgravia, and she would do it under the soft, pink wax of perfect manners. By the end of the evening, every woman in London who mattered would know that the Duke of Ravenmore had a private seamstress installed in his house. Ottilie folded the invitation. She walked to the Dowager's sitting room. The Dowager read it without expression. "You will go," she said. "Your Grace, you will go, child, because if you do not, she wins. She is counting on your shame. Bring it back to her unspent. I have nothing to wear, Your Grace." The Dowager looked up at her, then with the smallest, driest smile Ottilie had ever seen on a human face. "You are a seamstress," she said. "Make something." Ottilie made something. She had 4 days. She did not sleep more than 3 hours of any of them. She used the bolt of pewter gray silk she had purchased on Bedford Street in her first week, and she stitched a gown that was the color of a pigeon's wing and as plain as a psalm. The bodice was high, and the sleeves were long, and the only ornament was a single narrow band of darker gray velvet at the hem, into which she sewed, by candlelight on the third night, with her left hand, a small wish. Let me not be afraid. On the morning of the 28th, she dressed alone, and she went down to the carriage that was waiting. The Duke was in the front hall. She had not expected him. She stopped on the bottom step of the staircase. "Miss Brennan." "Your Grace, my mother tells me you are going to Tremaine House, alone." "Yes, Your Grace. The invitation was for me." "Then I will accompany you, with your permission. Lady Persen is my fiancée. It would be discourteous of me not to attend." Ottilie understood that the Dowager had told him. She understood that he had been waiting in the front hall for the better part of an hour. "You may accompany me, Your Grace." He inclined his head. He offered her his arm. She did not take it. She walked beside him to the carriage, half a pace behind, the way a seamstress walks beside her employer, and she felt, rather than saw, the small flicker of approval in him at her refusal. In the carriage, neither of them spoke. Tremaine House was lit like a small kingdom. Lady Persen stood at the head of the receiving line in a gown of cream silk Ottilie did not recognize. She had not made it. It had been ordered from Paris in secret, and she was radiant. "Cassius, darling." Lady Persen kissed the air beside his cheek. "And Miss Brennan, how thoughtful of His Grace to bring you. I had quite expected you to come in a hackney." "His Grace insisted, my lady." "Of course he did." The smile did not move. "Do come in." Ottilie followed Lady Persen into the drawing room. There were perhaps 40 women in it, and the air was thick with attar of roses. Lady Persen led Ottilie through the room, the way a hunter leads a hound through a wood, pausing at the Countess of Westbourne, pausing at Mrs. Hartshaw, who had a daughter being presented in the spring. Ottilie answered each question politely. She did not flinch. She did not look for the Duke. She felt his eyes on her from across the room, once, briefly, and she did not turn her head. And then Lady Percent struck. It was not done loudly. The cruel things in such rooms were never done loudly. Lady Percent simply gathered 6 women around the fire and said, in the kind of voice that suggests a small confidence, "Miss Brennan has been so wonderfully resourceful this autumn. Did you know, Lady Pinhope, that she is the very seamstress whose hand finished the late Duchess's burial gown? Quite by accident, of course. Her mother attached the pearls. It is the most remarkable coincidence." The room froze. Ottilie's hand did not shake on her cup. The Duke had not been told. She understood that in the same breath. Lady Percent had announced it now, in front of 40 women, so that Ottilie would have to watch his face when he heard it. Across the drawing room, the Duke of Ravenmore stood very still. He was holding a glass of claret. The claret was perfectly level in the glass. The Countess of Westbourne, who was not a stupid woman, said, "Percent, dear, perhaps—" "Oh no, Cassia. I think it is lovely. Don't you think so, Cassius? That your dear Cordelia and Miss Brennan's mother were stitched into the same Percent." The Duke had crossed the room. He did not raise his voice. The single word fell into the drawing room the way a stone falls into a well. Clean, vertical, and heavy enough to silence the surface of the water. Lady Percent turned her bright, fixed face up to him. "Yes, my love. You will not speak my wife's name in this room again. You will not speak Miss Brennan's mother's name in this room again. You will not speak of either of them in the same breath as the other. Not in this drawing room. Not in any drawing room. Do you understand me?" The room had gone entirely still. Lady Percent's smile cracked like ice underfoot. "Cassius, I was paying her a kindness. You thought it would humiliate her in front of these ladies. You have not humiliated her. You have humiliated yourself, and you have spoken about a woman I loved as though she were a tea-table anecdote. I will not stay in this house another quarter hour. Miss Brennan, will you accompany me?" Ottilie set down her cup. "Yes, Your Grace." She walked out of the drawing room of Tremaine House with the Duke at her side, and behind her she heard nothing. No whisper, no scandalized gasp, only the small, precise sound of 40 women remembering exactly what they were going to repeat tomorrow morning. In the carriage, the Duke did not speak for a long time. When at last he did, his voice was very low. "My mother told me about my wife's gown. She told me yesterday. I had decided to come to you tomorrow and tell you that I knew, and that it changed nothing. She said it first, in a drawing room, in front of 40 witnesses. Your Grace, it does not matter that she said it first. It matters to me, Miss Brennan." He looked at her in the dimness of the carriage, and his gray eyes were not tired any longer. They were something else. "You are wearing a gown you made yourself," he said at last. "I don't know how I know. I know. There is a wish stitched into the hem. What is it? That I would not be afraid. And are you?" "No, Your Grace. I am not." The carriage turned into Caromere Square. "I will break the engagement," he said quietly. "Tomorrow. In the morning. I will go to the Earl of Tremaine, and I will release her without conditions. I am telling you, because I promised you, in my study, that I would tell you before I told her. I am keeping that promise now. You have not told her yet. I will tell her tomorrow, by noon. You have my word." "Then I have nothing to say to you tonight, Your Grace, except thank you." He nodded. The carriage stopped. He helped her down. They walked together through the front hall and up the great staircase, and at the corridor that led to her wing, He stopped. "Good night, Miss Brennan." "Good night, Your Grace." He bent his head. He did not kiss her. He pressed his forehead, for the space of one drawn breath, against hers. Gently, carefully, as a man who has been holding something fragile sets it down. And he said, against her hair, "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever she does, thank you for the wish." Then he stepped back. He turned. He walked away down the long corridor, and Ottilie did not breathe until the door of his rooms had closed behind him. She walked to her own door. There was another folded paper on the floor. The wax was still soft. The note read, in the same tight slanted hand, "She knows." She has gone to Threadneedle Lane. Ottilie did not stop to think. She did not change out of the pewter gray gown. She seized her cloak from the back of the workroom door, and she ran. Down the back stairs, past the sleeping kitchens, out through the tradesman's yard, into the cold black October street. The hackney cab she found at the corner of Carrowmere Square took her shilling, and woke up enough to crack his whip. She stood in the cab with her hand against the window and watched London slide past, and she thought of Mary Pell, 16 years old, asleep on the camp bed in the back of the workshop, and she thought of the note on the first night, "Your apprentice will not have a workshop to go to by the end of the week," and she understood now that she in the note had never been Lady Persen. Lady Persen did not know Mary Pell's name. The note writer was someone closer. The hackney turned into Threadneedle Lane. Ottilie saw the smoke before she saw the workshop. It was thin. It wasn't a fire. Whoever had done this had not wanted to wake the neighbors. Whoever had done this had wanted Ottilie to walk into the result alone. The smoke came from inside number 11, drifting out from beneath the front door of the chandler's shop and curling up the side of the building in a slow gray thread. Ottilie threw a handful of coins at the driver and ran. The chandler's door was unlocked. As she climbed the narrow stairs 2 at a time, the workshop door stood open. Mary was on the landing. She was alive. She was crying. She was holding a tin pail of water, and her sleeve was scorched at the cuff. And when she saw Ottilie, she said in a voice that broke, "I got it out, miss. I got it out. Most of the silks are gone, but I got it out." Ottilie went past her into the workshop. It was ruin, not fire. Not properly. Someone had come up the back stairs with a small lantern and a bottle of lamp oil, and they had poured the oil along the cutting table and across the bolts of fabric on the press, and they had set it alight, and then they had not stayed, to make sure it caught. The flame had eaten the silks and the cottons and half of the wool, and Mary had woken to the smoke and beaten the rest out with a wet blanket. The workshop was destroyed. Mary was beside her, still crying. "I'm sorry, miss. I should have heard him on the stairs. Him. A man, miss. I heard a man. I didn't see his face. He went down the back stairs when he heard me coming. He was a small man, miss. Narrow shoulders. He wore a long coat with a high collar." Ottilie's stomach turned over. She had seen that coat before. She had seen it on the small man with narrow shoulders who had stood in the corridor outside the dowager's sitting room 3 mornings ago, and who had looked at her once, briefly, and turned his face away. "Peter," Mary said. "What?" "Peter. Your friend the constable. He's downstairs. He came up when he saw the smoke." Ottilie sat down on the top step of the staircase because her knees had failed her again. Mary sat down beside her. After a moment, Mary put an arm around her shoulders, and Ottilie, who had not let anyone embrace her in 9 years, since the day they had carried her father out, leaned, very carefully, and let her 16-year-old apprentice hold her up. "It can be rebuilt," Mary said. "I'm not leaving, miss. I'm 16, and I'm not a fool. I know what it means when a fine lady hires a poor seamstress, and a workshop burns. I'm not leaving." Ottilie closed her eyes. The gray October dawn was beginning at the far end of Threadneedle Lane. Peter Halverston came up the stairs with the watchman behind him, and they walked through the wreckage and counted what was lost and what could be saved, and Ottilie sat on the top step and watched her old life lie in pieces below her, and for the first time since the night of the announcement, she let herself cry properly. When she had finished, she dried her face on the cuff of the pewter gray gown. She stood up. She took Mary's hand and went down the stairs, and she said to Peter, "I need you to come with me to Ravenmore House. Now. Please." He did not argue. It was not yet 7 in the morning when the hackney cab returned to Carrowmere Square. Mrs. Halverston met Ottilie in the front hall in her morning bombazine, took one look at her face, took one look at the pewter gray gown, which was now smeared with ash at the hem, and said, "Upstairs. Now. The Dowager is awake." The Dowager rose from her writing desk when Ottilie came in. "Tell me," Ottilie told her. The Dowager listened without sitting down. When Ottilie reached the description of the small man with narrow shoulders, the Dowager closed her eyes briefly, as a woman closes her eyes who has just had a long-suspected thing confirmed. "Thomas Vell," the Dowager said. "Your Grace?" "My son's under steward. He was my late husband's secretary for 30 years. He was devoted to my late daughter-in-law, to Cordelia. He has never recovered from her death. He has watched my son for 9 years and decided, in whatever poisoned chamber of his own heart, that any woman who enters this house is a betrayal of her. He wrote the note on your first night. He set the fire tonight. He believes he is loyal. Your Grace, my apprentice, your apprentice will be brought here this morning. Mr. Vell will be removed from this house before noon. Quietly. Permanently. Mrs. Halverston will see to it. Now sit down, child. I am going to call my son." "Your Grace, please." "Not yet." "Yes," said the Dowager. "Now." She rang the bell. The Duke arrived in his shirt sleeves. He had been dressing. He had not finished. He came into the sitting room with his cravat untied and his coat over his arm, and he saw Ottilie sitting in the chair by the fire in a smoke-stained gray gown with a cut on her hand she had not noticed, and his face went through 3 expressions in the space of 2 seconds: relief, comprehension, and a fury so absolute that the Dowager said sharply, "Cassius, sit. Listen first. Act after." He sat. He listened. When the Dowager had finished, he did not speak for a long moment. Then he stood. He crossed the room to the chair where Ottilie sat. He knelt. He, the 8th Duke of Ravenmore, knelt on the carpet of his mother's sitting room, and he took Ottilie's scorched right hand in both of his, and he turned it over and looked at the small cut on the heel of her palm, and he pressed his lips, very briefly, to the cut, and he said, "I will go to Tremaine House at 9 o'clock. I will end the engagement at 9 o'clock. I will return here by 11. We will rebuild your workshop together. I do not know yet what comes after that, Miss Brennan. I know only that I would like, if you will permit it, to find out." Ottilie's eyes filled. "I will permit it," she said. The Dowager, behind them, looked away into the fire and did not pretend she was not also weeping. He went to Tremaine House at 9 o'clock. He did not return at 11. He did not return at noon. He did not return at 1 or 2 or 3. And by 4 o'clock, the gray October afternoon had begun to dim toward evening, and Ottilie sat at the great oak table in her workroom with Mary Pell, newly installed in the next room, wearing a clean dress of Sally's, eating an apple, and she stitched because she did not know what else to do. At 4:30, a footman brought her a letter. It was on Tremaine paper. It was sealed with Tremaine wax. It had been written in a hand Ottilie had seen once, on a rose-pink note about the light in Belgravia, and the address on the front said only, Miss Brennan, Ravenmore House. By hand. Ottilie broke the seal. Miss Brennan, by the time you read this, my engagement to His Grace, the Duke of Ravenmore, will have been dissolved. He came to my father's house this morning at 9 o'clock. He spoke for less than 10 minutes. He returned the ring. He left at 20 minutes past 9. I am writing because my father has forbidden me to write to him. I would like you to know 3 things. First, I did not order the fire at your workshop. I did not know it had been ordered. I learned of it from my maid this morning. I am vain and I am cold. But I am not, Miss Brennan, I am not that. Whatever Mr. Vell did, he did from his own corruption, not mine. Second, I told him, last night after we quarreled, that I was certain you and the Duke had become attached. I told Mr. Vell because he was the only person in the household who I was sure would do something. I did not tell him to set a fire. I told him only that you had to be removed. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you so that you will know. Third, he was never going to love me. I knew this before the announcement. I had decided, with my mother's encouragement, that a duke who did not love me was still a duke, and that love could be acquired in a marriage the way a country acquires a colony, slowly and against the will of the inhabitants. I see now that this was a child's reasoning. He was always going to love the woman behind the curtain at the engagement ball, even if she had not been you. Some men have been waiting so long to be allowed to love that the first true permission undoes them. You did not steal him. You only happened to be the first person in 11 years he was permitted to look at. I am leaving for Italy next week. I wish you no harm. Persen Halvorth Ottilie read the letter twice. She folded it. She walked to the workroom fire and held it over the coals, and at the last moment, she pulled her hand back. She did not burn the letter. She walked to her bedchamber and put it into the small carved box that held her mother's letters and the first anonymous note, and she closed the lid. Then she took a different paper from her writing desk, a paper she had written that morning, while Peter and Mary had walked through the ruin and counted what was lost. She had written a letter ending it. She had written, Your Grace, I cannot stay. The cost is too great. Mary's sleeve was burned. Your mother's house is full of men who would set fires for love of a dead woman. Let this be the end of a kindness that should not have crossed a ballroom. She had told herself that if he did not come back by 4 o'clock, she would leave the letter with Mrs. Halverston and be back in Threadneedle Lane by nightfall. She held the letter now over the same coals. She did not pull her hand back this time. She watched it burn. The corner caught, and the flame ran up the page and ate her own careful hand, and her own careful reasoning, and the wish she had not stitched into it. Let me leave before I am loved, went up in a small gray curl of smoke. She walked back to her workroom. She sat down at the great oak table. She picked up the gown she had been stitching for Lady Sabriel, and she put her needle into the cloth, and she waited. At 5:20, she heard the carriage on the gravel drive. At 5:25, she heard his step on the stair. At 5:26, the workroom door opened, and the 8th Duke of Ravenmore stood in the doorway, in a coat she had stitched 3 years ago, with a cut at his temple, and a bruise rising beside his left eye, and a small dried smear of blood on the cuff of his shirt. And Ottilie understood, without his having to explain, that it had not been a quarrel of words. Your Grace, it is done, Miss Brennan. Your face, her father struck me. I permitted it. He had the right. It is done. She rose from the table. She crossed the room. She did not stop until she was standing in front of him, and she lifted her hand, and she touched the bruise rising beside his left eye, and he closed his eyes under her fingers, as a man closes his eyes who has not been touched in 9 years. I burned a letter today, she said. What letter? The one ending this. I had written it this morning. I was going to leave it with your mother if you did not return by 4 o'clock. And why did you burn it? Because you returned at 20 past 5, Your Grace, and because a stitch made with a wish in it carries the wish wherever the cloth goes, and because I have been wishing the wrong wish for 9 days, and I would like, if you will permit it, to wish a different one now. What wish, Ottilie? It was the first time he had said her name. She did not answer with words. She rose onto the toes of her work shoes, and she pressed her mouth against the bruise beside his left eye, gently, the way one stitches a tear that must not be allowed to widen. And after that, she pressed her forehead against his chest, and she stood there, with her ear against the green wool coat she had finished by candlelight 3 years ago, and she listened to his heart. It was beating quickly. His arms came around her slowly, as a man who is afraid of breaking a thing he has just been given. "Stay," he said, against her hair. "I am staying. Marry me." "Yes." "Now?" "As soon as the law and your mother and Mary's sleeve allow it, Your Grace." He laughed then. It was a small, surprised sound. The dowager, who was standing in the corridor outside the workroom door, because she had heard the carriage too, and because she was 71 years old and had earned the right to listen at doors in her own house, pressed her hand against her mouth and walked very quietly back to her sitting room, and she sat down at her writing desk, and she wrote a single line in her diary, which read, "Today my son laughed." The weeks that followed were quiet. That was the surprise. Ottilie had braced, the morning after the workshop fire, for a tide of scandal, and the tide came, but it broke against the walls of Ravenmore House and didn't enter. The dowager was a seawall. She was, Ottilie discovered, the most feared woman in London among the generation that mattered, and she had spent 40 years storing up the small, careful favors that such a woman stores. The Countess of Westbourne was visited at home for an hour and emerged a public defender of Miss Brennan's character. The editor of a minor society paper received a private letter and printed nothing further. By the end of the second week, the gossip had gone underground, where the dowager preferred it. Lady Persson sailed for Italy on the 7th of November. Mr. Thomas Vell was removed from Ravenmore House the morning of the fire and placed, by the dowager's arrangement, in a quiet position as a clerk in a charitable foundation in Bristol. The dowager said only, when Ottilie asked her why she had not had him prosecuted, "Because he loved her, child. Foolishly, terribly, ruinously. I will not punish a man for the only love he ever had. I will only ensure he cannot poison anyone else." Mary Pell stayed at Ravenmore House for 4 days, and then asked, with considerable dignity for 16 years old, whether she might return to Threadneedle Lane and oversee the rebuilding. The Duke paid for the work, quietly, through Mr. Whitler the merchant, and Mary did not know it for a year. The workshop reopened on the 1st of December with a new sign on the door, Brennan and Pell, Modistes, and Mary was the proprietor. The Duke and Ottilie were married very quietly on the 18th of December in the small chapel at the Ravenmore estate in the country. There were 11 people present: the dowager, Lady Sabriel, Mary Pell in a gown she had made herself, Mrs. Halverston, who wept and did not pretend otherwise, Peter the constable, the vicar, 2 witnesses from the village, the Duke's old friend, Lord Margrave, who had come down from the north on 3 days' notice, and who was the only man besides the Duke himself who had loved Cordelia, and whose presence the Duke had requested because he did not want to enter a second marriage without the blessing of someone who had loved his first wife. Lord Margrave had given the blessing. He had said, with one hand on the Duke's shoulder, "She would have liked her." That was all. It had been enough. Ottilie wore a gown of dove-gray wool with a single narrow band of darker gray velvet at the hem. There was a wish stitched into the cuff of the left sleeve, in her own left-handed stitching, which read, "Let us be brave together." She did not show him the wish. She was saving it for later. It was on a Tuesday in February, 2 months after the wedding, that he found the embroidery. They had come down from the country to Carrowmere Square for the new session of Parliament, and Ottilie had been unpacking the trunks in their bedchamber when the Duke had come in with the green wool coat over his arm. "Ottilie." "Yes, my love. My valet has just shown me something. He says he found it last week when he was relining the cuff. He did not show it to me at the time. He has shown it to me this morning because he believes I should see it." She turned. He had folded back the lining of the left cuff of the green wool coat. There, on the underside of the lining, where it had not been seen by any human eye for 3 years, in tiny, careful left-handed stitches in dark green silk on dark green wool, was a single line of words she had embroidered when she was 16 years old and had finished all 18 buttonholes and had a few inches of thread left over and an odd impulse to leave a sign of herself somewhere in the world that no one would ever see. "Wherever you go, I am with you." She had forgotten it. She had genuinely, completely forgotten she had stitched it. She had told herself it was foolish. She had told herself no one would ever see it. She had been correct for 3 years. The Duke was looking at the inside of his own cuff. "Ottilie." "Yes. I have been wearing this for 3 years. I know. I have been wearing this for 3 years. And inside the cuff, against the inside of my left wrist where my pulse beats, there has been a stitched line that says, 'Wherever you go, I am with you.' Yes, my love. You were 16. I was 16. You did not know me. I did not know you. And yet, he sat down on the edge of the bed. He pressed the inside of the cuff very gently against the side of his face, against the bruise that had long since healed beside his left eye, against the line of his jaw, against his mouth. And he did not weep, but his shoulders shook, and Ottilie sat down beside him and put her arm around him, and he leaned against her, and for a long time they did not speak. After a while he said, "It worked, Ottilie." "What worked?" "The wish. I have been with you. Wherever I went." She kissed the top of his ash-gray hair. "The Dowager wrote a thing in her diary in October," she said, "the night you came home with your bruise. She wrote, 'Today my son laughed.' She has been keeping a list since that day of every time you have laughed. There were 143 entries by Christmas Eve. My mother is keeping a list. She is keeping a list." He laughed then, quietly, into the bed linen, and Ottilie thought, 144, and she did not say it aloud. "There is one more thing," he said after a while. "On our wedding day, you wore a wish at your cuff. I saw it. I did not read it. May I read it now?" She lifted her wrist. The wish she had stitched was on the cuff of her left sleeve in dark gray thread, and it read, "Let us be brave together." And he read it twice, and he closed his eyes, and he said, "We will be." That spring, the workshop on Threadneedle Lane took on 3 new apprentices. Mary Pell turned 17 in March and had her own corner of the cutting room. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenmore began, very quietly, to commission small pieces from Brennan and Pell. She paid in full. She insisted on the bill. Lady Sabriel was presented at court in May in a gown stitched by her sister-in-law, and the simplicity became briefly fashionable, and Madame Vautrin's establishment lost a great deal of business and never quite recovered. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenmore were not, in their first year, popular in the drawing rooms of Belgravia. They became popular in the second. By the third, the story of the seamstress and the alcove had passed into the kind of household legend that society repeats with affection. The Dowager kept her list. It ran to 460 entries by their first wedding anniversary. On the morning of their first anniversary, the Duke woke before atelier and reached for the small carved box on her side table, where she kept her mother's letters and her mother's brass thimble. He took, from the pocket of his dressing gown, a small folded paper. He had written it the previous evening. It read, "To my wife, on our first anniversary, I do not know how to thank a 16-year-old girl in a workroom for a wish she stitched into the lining of a coat for a stranger. I know only that the stranger has spent his life inside that wish without knowing it, and that he intends to spend the rest of it deserving it. C." He laid the paper inside the box. He set it gently on top of her mother's letters, and the burned corner first note, and Lady Persand's letter from Tremaine House, and the brass thimble engraved M.B. He closed the box. He turned back to his wife, and he kissed her shoulder, where the dove-gray nightgown had slipped, and she stirred, and woke, and smiled at him in the pale December light, and the 8th Duke of Ravenmore, who had once been a man carved out of his own life rather than born into it, pressed his face against her hair and breathed in the faint living scent of lavender and rosewater and the old soft camphor she had used in her workshop on Threadneedle Lane, and he understood, finally, that he had come home. A stitch made with a wish in it carries the wish wherever the cloth goes. His mother had told her son, many years ago, that he had been a difficult baby, that he had cried at every christening gown, at every linen, and had only quieted, for some reason no nurse had ever explained, when he was wrapped in a small green blanket from a market stall in Shrewsbury. The dowager had bought the blanket from a young woman in a market square. The young woman had stitched it herself. Her name had been Merwin Brennan. The dowager had never told her son. She told him on his 2nd wedding anniversary, in front of the fire, with Ottilie sitting on the arm of his chair, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he laughed, softly, the way he laughed now, and he reached up and took his wife's hand. "Wherever you go," he said. "I am with you," she answered. The fire popped. The dowager wrote it down. "Thank you for being here. Stories like this exist because you make space for them, for slow love, for women with skill in their hands, for men who are permitted, at last, to choose. If a moment in this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which one. Your favorite line tells us what to write next. If you would like more romances built on craft and courage and quiet kindness, consider subscribing. A single click means the next story finds you when it is ready. Until then, may every coat you wear have a wish stitched into its lining, and may every wish you have stitched into the world come back to you.